Jesus ruffled feathers all along the course of his ministry. Not everyone was out to get him. Even among the named religious groups and their leaders. Sometimes a text may be a little confusing along that line. But it was not everybody. But there were still many who had come to oppose him at seemingly every turn. They took offense at his teaching because it was inconvenient. It held too many things that were against the established norms of life and their religious practices. Rather than focusing on their rules, their rights, and their regulations, Jesus' words were just too open-handed toward the no-account scum who did not contribute to society according to the accepted ways. The only path they could see to deal with him was to shut him up for good. Then life could go back to normal. Normal wasn't great, but normal was known. It was comfortable. Some among the Pharisees had risen in opposition to him, trying to call him out and get him in trouble with the people. Other Pharisees, perhaps, and probably a minority among them, approached him with a warning of political forces that were moving against him. Herod, in particular, was on a warpath to silence Jesus, whom he took as some sort of renewal of John the Baptist's opposition that Herod had tried to stamp out, even if unsuccessfully. Telling Jesus of their concerns for his safety, they encouraged him to leave the area around Jerusalem, to put as much distance as possible so that he would be somewhere beyond Herod's easy reach. Jesus' response did not fit their expectations. It's not that he did not take the threat seriously. He saw it as nothing to avoid. He sent word telling Herod that he was remaining in the region. He would continue his public ministry of healing for another 2 days before entering Jerusalem directly on the 3rd. He would be in Jerusalem, where every prophet met their death at the hands of political forces opposed to the ways of Yahweh. He would be easy to find. He would not be hiding in any remote corner. Then Jesus continued addressing the threat before him. He decried how, over the centuries, Jerusalem had been the scene of opposition to the ways of Yahweh. From the very start, this had been the case. Yahweh had planned from before the days of Abraham to establish Jerusalem as the very center point, the focus of Yahweh's provision for all people. The nation was supposed to be a light to all other nations. It was to be the centerpiece pointing to the very best way to live. It should have been the hub of a society in which everyone enjoyed the full bounty of Yahweh's provision and blessing. God had ever wanted to provide for, guide, and protect Jerusalem. As a hen gathers her chicks for protection, as well as teaching them to feed, to grow, and become chickens in their own right. It was in Jerusalem, however, that prophets were lynched, imprisoned, cast aside as troublemakers, the nation had never wanted to embrace the ways of Yahweh. They were unwilling to trust that Yahweh's provision could and would be sufficient for everyone. Rather than sharing the wealth and abundance set before them, they determined to wield power to accumulate provision for some, while others went without. This distrust of Yahweh and the ways of Yahweh was and would be their undoing. Distrusting God fed distrust of one another. The result would be new enemies laying siege once again to Jerusalem from all sides. This had never been Yahweh's design for them. This was the result of denying God's ways and substituting our own. They had ignored God's expectations time and time again. Back in the days of Moses, the ways of Yahweh had been set out before them. They were to enter this land promised to Abraham with the understanding that nothing belonged to them. Everything before them belonged to Yahweh. It would come under their care to provide for their well-being, as well as for any and all who chanced to be in this land they were going to inhabit. This land flowing with milk and honey was not to be abused for personal benefit while others went without. It was designed to provide amply for the needs of all. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was looking upon the resources at their disposal as their own. They refused to share of Yahweh's bounty with strangers passing through. They had banished concepts of hospitality, by which even the Greeks and Romans measured someone's righteousness. They had chosen to oppress any who fell into their power. The same attitude and sin had led to the Jewish exile to Babylon. While Isaiah had called the people and their leaders back to Yahweh's standards of justice, in which the needs of all were met with equanimity. Isaiah and Jeremiah had decried their stubbornness. Amos, Micah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Nehemiah, Zephaniah, and others had all spoken to the very same abandonment of Yahweh's principles. From the very beginning, creation was established to provide abundantly for all life. Fertility was inherent to life, all placed upon the earth. All life. Every ecosystem teemed with whole varieties of life that function together in a wonderful interplay of interdependence, in which it was seemingly impossible to keep life from its intention of self-reproduction. That is the world of God's creation. The world and the way of God to which we are called to enjoy, share, and nurture. Rather than fulfill this purpose, however, we have rebelled over and over and over against being those chicks nestled under their mother's wings, as she guards, guides, feeds, protects, and teaches them to become the chickens they were designed to become. We establish our self-importance above the needs of others. It's as though if we don't take more than our share, supply will run out on us. And this way we craft our own destruction. We enact our own fall from God's design, from God's purposes. Yahweh's land belonged to Yahweh alone. We were placed here as caretakers. Our task is not to accumulate, it is to share. Our lives are more abundant and fulfilled in living this way. The herds belong to Yahweh. The birds in the trees, the squirrels scampering across the lawn, and the oaks producing their overabundance of acorns are all God's. They're not our own. The mineral resources we appropriate are God's, along with the fish, the rivers, the bats, oceans, and bees. The produce of the world we inhabit is for the welfare of all, not for some privileged few. When we have been called to embody this way of life as caretakers of God's creation for the benefit of all, we have repeatedly rebelled. We rebelled when told we were destroying the environment on which our very lives depended. We wiped out bison to starve native cultures depending on them for their living. We overfished streams, rivers, lakes, oceans, with no concerns for sustainability as caretakers. We destroyed forests in quests of greed for wealth and power. We drained nutrients from the land in mass monoculture production of cotton, tobacco, and sugar, while oppressing human beings to produce wealth for the few. In reading today's passage this week, I was called back to Isaiah and Jeremiah, Amos, all the other prophets, to see what it was that they said about Israel abandoning Yahweh and Yahweh's desire to gather Israel back together. And all of their words focused on provision for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the vulnerable. Sharing resources. If there's one theme in the prophets, that's it. Yahweh's call to be responsible caretakers for the general welfare fell on deaf ears, generation after generation after generation. We killed those calling us to live responsibly as one people, as siblings, as equal participants in God's creation. Jesus did not weep over what awaited him in Jerusalem. He wept for what would never be, for all that could have been, that yet could come, for what we continue to refuse. Humanity's failure pressed down upon him. We could have enjoyed Yahweh's bounty, abundant life in community under God's plan and design. That's what we were called to. We chose infighting, struggle, creating conditions of distrust among one another. We chose to distrust God and God's provision as insufficient for all creation. But life of love is so much simpler and fuller than that. Why do we insist on embracing such a harder road to hoe?